Middle school. I don't know about all of you, but whenever I think about those 2 years of my life, I can't help but think mistakes. Simply mistakes. From the things I did to the things I took so seriously that never really mattered. Dances come to mind, and some of the people I surrounded myself with. My best friend at the time and I were talking about boys because middle school, and we got on the subject about a boy she thought had liked me then, so I asked her how so. I'm 17 now, and I still think about her response to this day. She said with a chuckle, "He probably likes you because he has yellow fever." And just out of curiosity's sake, how many people out in the audience have heard of the term yellow fever outside the disease context? Okay, so there are a number of you. Just to make sure everybody's on the same page, yellow fever is a term used for when a person has a sexual or relationship-based preference for Asians. More on that later. One of the many mistakes I made when I was in middle school is how I responded. I laughed along with her, and we continued on our merry way. That was one of my interactions with racial fetishization, which is defined as the sexualization or obsession with someone's race and or ethnicity. I will acknowledge that my experience with it is by no means one of the most horrific stories out there, but we have to acknowledge that just as fetishization is a form of racism and prejudice and oppression exist in tiers that are fundamentally built on things such as seemingly harmless comments like the one my friend felt comfortable making to me that support that escalation and behavior that allows it to potentially become normalized. This isn't an issue can stand idly by any longer, as racial fetishization has very real consequences in the way it extends the reign of racism and misogyny in the lives of women of color throughout society. In this talk, I'll be focusing specifically on the fetishization of Asian women and how it's present in our history, how it has relevance now, and what we can do about it. But this focus is by no means an invalidation on the ways it affects Black, Latino, Native American, and other communities of color, as not just women, but also men and non-gender conforming people are affected by racial fetishization. Racism and misogyny make themselves present in multitudes of ways in the lives of women of color. Some key examples include how they could and have been valued for their bodies and stereotyped as people, especially in the context of racial fetishization. Some ways people who proudly wear race fetishes on their sleeves try to justify and explain their sole attraction to women of color is through how certain physical features that they possess are just attracted to them, or they'll assign certain personality traits or attributes to them that make them worthy of praise, or how they'll put it at least, such as how Black women are stereotyped as being curvy, Latino women are seen as being sassy, and Asian women are seen as being submissive. And a glaring issue with the objectification dehumanization of a person is how it can incorrectly and dangerously translate into a feeling of entitlement over that person's body or attention. And just to set the record straight, there is a very distinct difference between having a preference and race fetishes, as having a preference and knowing what you like, such as certain personality traits, is understandable, as we develop preferences for the people we want around us in our lives as we grow up. However, the very nature of racial fetishization encourages a climate of the sexual exploitation and violence against women of color through the way it objectifies their bodies and stereotypes their existence, where these people will equate them to a body and like the idea of them simply because of their racial background. Racial fetishization, like many issues, didn't just appear out of the blue. It has historical context, which in this case we can attribute to colonialization and imperialism, as the conquest of foreign lands was justified through white man's burden, a term coined in a poem by Rudyard Kipling about colonizing the Philippines, as it was perceived to be the Westerners' responsibility to educate and enlighten the people of these foreign lands on the way of the West, which they perceived as civilized and right. Quite ironic when we consider how borderline barbaric colonizers were in the countries they invaded, as they not only exploit the land, but also its people. For women in particular, they are often seen as trophies of colonialization, beings to be conquered for the sexual gratification of the colonizers. One example that comes to mind would be when the U.S. got involved during the Philippines revolt against Spain in the late 1800s, and spoiler alert, the U.S. would eventually go on to occupy the country. And while war waged on, American military forces are responsible for the killings of 800,000 to over 1 million Filipinos, and it also engaged in the sexual conquest of the women, as the soldiers perceived the Filipino women as little brown effing machines powered by rice. And unfortunately, cases like these are present throughout history, such as the brothel systems and military sex tourism industries that begin to flourish during World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War, as well as how the mail order bride industry began to flourish during when American feminists were making strides in their movement as men sought to have someone more submissive in their homes. I bring this up as our history has a great level of influence into why our world is the way it is, for better or for worse. In the case of the worse, seeing Asian women as beings to be conquered came from the mentality of conquering the land as colonizers sought strategies to exercise as much control and power as they could. With the knowledge we have about the historical context of racial fetishization, now we have to talk about its relevance now. Specifically, how it has a direct correlation with the sexual violence, abuse, and exploitation of Asian women. Rather than seeing yellow fever as a preference, let's see it for what it actually is. A smokescreen, a way of normalizing the rampant sexual violence against Asian women. How they are stereotyped as hypersexual and submissive, which has origins from the history like before, is dangerous as it allows others to assume that they can take advantage of them. According to Morgan Dewey, the National Network to End Domestic Violence Communications Coordinator, 41 to 61% of Asian women reported having experienced physical and or sexual violence by an intimate partner at some point in their lifetime. And that's just reported, and that number actually ended up being much higher than that of any other ethnic group within this study. The mistreatment at the hands of those familiar to them is a direct consequence of the widespread normalization of how Asian women are dehumanized and sexualized. In the most extreme and grave cases, this has even resulted in deaths and immense trauma. And with that being said, I'd like to pay tribute and remembrance to some of the victims of racial fetishization. Shu Ying Nguyen was a Vietnamese woman and was raped by two white American men who had called her racial slurs and then burned her alive. She was 28 and forced to leave behind a family in the spring of 2018. Over 90 Chinese immigrant students at the University of Southern California were assaulted by school gynecologists who took advantage of their immigration status, socioeconomic background, and their racial identity. In addition, in 2017, Ying Zhang, a visiting Chinese scholar at the University of Illinois, was raped and murdered. According to law enforcement who'd actually looked into the murderer's search history, he had visited an infamous fetish website and researched how to perform a kidnapping beforehand, meaning not only had he been thinking about it and the crime was premeditated, it also came from a fetishization mindset. And then with a conversation about how Asian women are impacted by sexual violence today, we also have to talk about human trafficking and view it in tangent with sexual harassment and domestic violence and other issues, as they can't be viewed separately. Human trafficking, which has been dubbed the new slavery, harms an unimaginable number of people all over the world on a daily basis. And unfortunately, most human trafficking revolves around women and their sexual exploitation. As Kimberly Moen-Orozco, author and an expert witness on human trafficking, civil and criminal court cases, wrote, Asian women are highly sought after because they are perceived by American men as being more submissive. In my interviews with commercial sex consumers and through research into the forums, they talk about their dislike of American women who they perceive as more recalcitrant to their sexual and social demands. It's really hard to see a simple preference as just that if it comes from an inherent desire for dominance and control. And the issue grows even more concerning and alarming when we get into the numbers on those targeted by human trafficking. As according to the UN International Labor Organization 2016, there was an estimated 3.8 million adults and 1 million children who were victims of forced sexual exploitation. And out of those individuals, more than 7 out of 10 of them were Asian. This report, as well as Moen-Orozco's research, gives us insight into the issue and sheer scale of human trafficking, as well as it illustrates exactly how a dark history of colonialization and the systematic stereotyping, dehumanization, objectification of Asian women has influenced and largely contributed to the number of them being sexually exploited and mistreated. And with these issues in mind, we have to talk about the emotional trauma and insecurity women who have suffered through such conditions may experience. For many Asian women, it can cause them to doubt the true intentions of their romantic partners, as they could be genuine about their feelings and like them for them, or they could find her attractive solely because of their yellow fever. That kind of treatment can cause a disorienting image of themselves and their self-worth if they are valued for the generalizations based on their racial identity and not on the essence of their being. I know that fear was instilled in me the moment my friend made that comment to me. Finally, the mental health consequences become even more concerning when we consider the fact that Asian people are 3 times less likely to seek out help according to the American Psychological Association. There are multiple factors that can explain this, such one being how mental health is a often stigmatized and somewhat of a taboo subject in Asian communities. And it is great that we are now in a time where we are talking about mental health more than ever before, and we are developing treatments and resources, but we also have to consider opening up access to those that may need it the most. With all that I've talked to you about today, I can't help but think about all those that have lost their lives, have had trauma to heal from, and it just makes my head spin and my heart ache for all the Asian women out there who had to go through this. And it's frustrating, so frustrating to see how downplayed racial fetishization is, as it has very real consequences and it harms so many people out there. And it begs the question on how many of their lives have to be taken and ruined before people with these dangerous beliefs, who believe that women of color are beings to be taken advantage of, before our society comes to a practiced consensus that harming women of all backgrounds, should be unfathomable. I am angry, simply put, beyond a doubt. But that isn't the reason why I'm standing here talking to you all. Because instead of anger, I am motivated by a desire to hopefully foster change and express love for the Asian community. And I'm confident and gradual, painful, but necessary change to happen. Racial fetishization doesn't have a simple cause, and it won't have a simple solution either. So combating it requires us to tackle issues such as racism, sexism, a climate of sexual violence and exploitation, among others. Individually, we must act and speak up against the wrongdoings we see. Don't let some harmless comments about objectifying women go unchecked, because when those comments are left unchallenged, they reinforce a culture in which women are seen as bodies, not people. Holding people accountable for their actions and words is important because it helps us better ourselves and our society, because simply put, and honestly, we have to expect better from people. Even if we don't directly say or do something wrong ourselves, we become complacent in our silence and inaction if we just watch and let it continue. In addition to considering our actions as individuals, we also have to think about ways society and institutions could change for the better, as it takes both societal and individual action to make change happen. Not one, not the other, but both. Whether you're new to or knowledgeable about these kinds of issues, there are still endless horizons for ways we can continue to learn something new and take meaningful action with the knowledge in hand. There are all kinds of things we as communities and individuals can do for the sake of a better future. We are all entitled to fair representation, autonomy over our own bodies, as well as safety and peace of mind. And it deeply saddens me that I have to say that at all, as it should just be assumed and universally agreed upon. But it's not, as there are people out there that believe that it's okay to violate those things for other people based on their identity, as if they're conditionals, things to be taken away from. We have to do all that we can, not just for ourselves, but for future generations, in order to get closer to a world where this is a standard accepted by everyone. Thank you.